vivid versions.
I remember the exact moment I understood what Priya and I had built together. Not because it was grand or cinematic, but because it was quietly real. We were in her kitchen on a Thursday evening. She was chopping bell peppers with that focused, slightly impatient energy she brought to everything. And I was sitting on the counter with a glass of Castellan Red, reading aloud from a review of a restaurant we'd been planning to try. The lamplight over the island was warm and specific. The city outside her Harrow Hill apartment was doing its usual Thursday hum. And I looked at her, at the particular way she tucked her bottom lip inward when she was concentrating, and I thought, this is the kind of thing you protect. That was 14 months before everything came apart. My name is Rowan Ashby. I'm 34. I work as a senior strategy director at Van Tis Group, a mid-sized consultancy that operates across financial services and infrastructure sectors. I came up through the analytical side of the business, modeling, risk assessment, competitive landscape work, before moving into the strategic layer about 4 years ago. I'm not going to pretend the rise was effortless, because it wasn't. It required the kind of sustained, deliberate effort that doesn't make for interesting dinner conversation. Early mornings, decisions made carefully and then committed to fully. A conscious choice to stay calm in rooms where other people were performing urgency. I didn't set out to be good at this. I just found that clarity, real clarity, was rarer than almost any other professional asset, and I had it in abundance. Priya Anand came into my life at a product launch event hosted by Mutual Contact, a quiet gathering of about 20 people in a rooftop space above Calden Street. She was a brand strategist at Foundry Creative, smart and confident in a way that felt earned rather than performed. We talked for 2 hours without noticing the time. She had strong opinions about the gap between how companies presented themselves and who they actually were, and she wasn't interested in softening those opinions for the sake of being liked. I found that interesting. I still do even now. We were together for just over a year. In the beginning, it was genuinely good. The kind of relationship that has its own internal rhythm, where you don't need to negotiate every interaction because you've developed a shared shorthand. We traveled to Seville for a long weekend in autumn. We had standing Sunday dinners at Bracken's on the high street. We met each other's friends and held our own in those introductions. And then, somewhere around the 8-month mark, the texture changed. I noticed it first as a small thing. The way she responded when I mentioned being asked to lead the Caldwell infrastructure pitch. It was a significant assignment, the kind that signals internal momentum. And when I told her about it over dinner at home, her reaction was a beat too slow. She said the right words, "That's great, Rowan, really," but her eyes had already moved to her wine glass. I filed it away, didn't react to it, didn't draw attention to it. I simply noted it the way you note a crack in a wall, probably nothing worth watching. It happened again 2 weeks later when I was promoted to lead the newly formed partnerships vertical. Vantis had been building toward this restructure for months, and my elevation to head the division was the kind of move that came with a real shift in scope. A small team reporting to me, a seat at the senior leadership table, direct client relationships at the executive level. When I told Priya, she congratulated me with a smile that didn't reach the rest of her face, and then pivoted immediately to talking about a project she was managing at Foundry. I let her talk. I listened properly, but I was thinking, she's not happy for me. She's recalibrating. The dynamic that followed was subtle at first, then less so. She began framing her own professional updates in comparative terms. I got pulled into the Harwick rebrand, which is basically our version of what you did with Caldwell, which I found revealing. Not because there was anything wrong with being proud of her work, but because the framing wasn't about her achievement. It was about closing a gap she perceived between us. I watched this pattern develop over the following weeks with the same attention I'd bring to a client's competitive behavior. She started arriving at social gatherings with an edge, inserting her professional credentials into conversations where they weren't relevant. She'd correct me in front of friends, not on facts, but on tone, on framing, in ways that weren't quite disagreements, but functioned like small assertions of territory. I didn't react to any of it. Reaction would have been both pointless and undignified. Instead, I started building a clearer picture of what was actually happening. She feels outpaced. She didn't expect that. And instead of processing it internally, she's externalizing it as competition. I'd seen this before in professional contexts. Capable people who respond to others' advancement by repositioning the relationship as a race. It's not malicious at its root. It's usually fear. But understanding the origin doesn't neutralize the effect. About 3 weeks after the partnership's promotion, we had friends over for dinner. 4 of us in my flat on Gressley Lane, a relaxed evening with good food and the kind of conversation that sprawls comfortably across topics. My colleague Lars mentioned, in passing, that the Vantis leadership team had been discussing an expansion into the Nordic market and that my name had come up in those conversations. Priya went very still. Later that night, after Lars and his partner had left, she said, "You never told me about the Nordic thing." "Because it's preliminary," I said. "Nothing's confirmed. You still could have mentioned it. I'm mentioning it now." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not anger, not sadness exactly, but something compressed. Then she started clearing glasses, and the subject was dropped. But I knew it wasn't dropped. It had simply been stored. I chose a Saturday afternoon for the conversation because I wanted us both to have room. No work commitments pending, no social obligation immediately after. I made coffee, set it on the table between us, and sat down. "I want to talk about something I've been observing," I said. "And I want to do it directly because I think you deserve that." She looked at me with her careful eyes. "Okay. Over the last couple of months, I've noticed that my career progression has become a source of tension between us. Not from my side. I've never framed anything I've accomplished as being about comparison. But from your side, I think something has shifted, and I don't think it's serving either of us." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You think I'm jealous? I think you're competitive with me," I said, "which is different. Jealousy is about wanting what someone has. Competition is about needing to close a gap that you've decided matters. I think you've decided our careers are a metric, and I've never agreed to that framework." That's a very analytical way to describe a relationship. "It's an accurate one," I said without any edge in it. "I'm not saying this to be clinical. I'm saying it because I think you're too capable and too smart to be running this particular internal program, and I'd rather address it honestly than watch it erode something that's been genuinely good." She looked down at her coffee. I could see her processing, weighing. "I don't love that you're so far ahead," she said finally. It cost her something to say it, and I respected that. "I understand," I said, "but I haven't done anything to be ahead of you. I've built something on my own track, the same way you're building something on yours. The only reason they feel comparative is because you've made them comparative. It's not that simple, Rowan." "It is, though. It's actually that simple." We talked for another hour. She acknowledged the pattern, said she'd work on it, and I believed her, not naively, but because she was self-aware enough to see what she'd been doing once it was named clearly. For about 3 weeks, things were better. She was more present, less performatively confident, and I felt us returning to something closer to the original register. Then she met someone at a Foundry client event, a senior partner at a firm called Vantis Group, my firm, and somehow, over the course of one conversation apparently, this person mentioned that I was being considered for a role that would put me in the company's upper leadership tier before I turned 35. She didn't mention the conversation to me. I found out from a Vantis colleague who'd been at the same event. She heard it from someone else before I told her, and she said nothing. That's not processing. That's containing something she doesn't know what to do with. The following weekend, at a dinner at our friends Cam and Delia's place, 6 of us around a table that seated 8, good wine, easy company. Priya mentioned her own career with a persistence that wasn't usual for her. Not once, but several times throughout the evening, she redirected conversations back to her work at Foundry, the client she was managing, the scope of her responsibility. It was subtle enough that I don't think anyone else noticed. But I noticed, because I knew what it was. It was a woman trying to hold ground in a competition only she could see. I drove us home in silence. She didn't feel it. That night, sitting in my study while she slept, I made the decision. Not with anger. I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter and more final. Like watching a calculation resolve. This isn't going to change. She's been given the opportunity to change it, and she's not able to. Every step I take forward will cost her something, and she'll keep finding ways to redirect that cost outward. That's not a relationship. That's a drain. I ended things on a Tuesday evening. I told her clearly and without drama. I said that I'd meant what I said during our Saturday conversation, that I'd watched carefully since then, and that the pattern hadn't changed in any meaningful way. I told her that I didn't think she was a bad person. I didn't, and I don't, but that I wasn't willing to be someone else's benchmark, that I had built something I was proud of, and I needed a partner who could exist alongside that without it becoming a wound. She cried. I handed her a glass of water and sat across from her and didn't backtrack or soften the substance of what I'd said, because softening it would have been a kindness in the moment and an unkindness in the long run. "You're so calm," she said at one point. "How are you this calm?" "Because I'm not angry," I told her. "And I'm not confused. This is just what I've decided." She left about an hour later. We didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. The decision was made, and it was final, and she knew me well enough to know that. I sat with the quiet in my flat for a while after she left and felt something I can only describe as clean. Not happy, not unaffected, but clear. The way you feel when a complicated process has finally resolved into its correct answer. I expected to move forward. For about 3 weeks, I did. The first sign that something was wrong came from my manager, Harriet Solberg, one of the 3 people in the company I respected without qualification. She called me into her office on a Wednesday morning with an expression that was carefully neutral, which was itself a signal. "There's been a complaint," she said, "filed through the anonymous reporting channel." I kept my face steady. "What kind of complaint?" "Misconduct. The specifics are vague, but the allegation broadly concerns your conduct with junior staff and a suggestion that some of your project decisions may have involved undisclosed conflicts of interest." I was quiet for a moment, not out of shock, not exactly, but because I was running through the parameters as fast as I could, while keeping my external expression completely level. Anonymous, vague, but specifically targeted, junior staff conduct, and conflicts of interest. These aren't random. Someone chose categories that would be plausible and difficult to disprove quickly. Someone who knows enough about the professional landscape to know what sounds credible. "Harriet," I said, "I want to request a formal investigation." She looked at me with a slight shift of expression, not quite surprise, but close to it. "You're requesting it yourself." "Immediately," I said. "I want everything examined. My communications, my project decisions, my interactions with junior staff. All of it. I want this done formally, documented properly, and I want to cooperate with every step." "That's not the response most people give," she said. "Most people have something to manage," I said. "I don't." She held my gaze for a moment and then nodded. "I'll initiate it today." I walked back to my desk with the same measured pace I always used. I sat down. I opened my project files and spent 20 minutes just thinking, not panicking, not catastrophizing, but thinking. Someone filed this. Someone with enough background knowledge to target specific categories. Someone who knows I've been managing junior analysts, knows I've been navigating cross-sector partnerships that could theoretically involve perceived conflicts. That's a relatively small pool of people. I thought about who in my professional world would have sufficient knowledge and sufficient motivation. Then I thought about Priya. She knew my role in precise detail. She'd heard me talk about the partnership's vertical, about the junior analysts I was mentoring, about the cross-sector nature of the new client relationships I was managing. She'd been inside my professional life for over a year. She also had motivation. I'd ended things 5 weeks ago, and beneath all of that quiet competitiveness had been, I now suspected, something sharper, a feeling of having been left behind that had curdled into something more deliberate. I didn't know, not yet, but I noted it the way I noted everything, carefully, without rushing to it, without letting the suspicion distort my behavior. First priority, be cleared. Second priority, understand what actually happened. The investigation was initiated formally that same afternoon. I cooperated with the HR-led investigation with the same thoroughness I brought to any significant project. I provided access to every communication channel relevant to my work, emails, internal messaging, project documentation. I gave a detailed account of every interaction I'd had with junior team members over the preceding 6 months, including context, professional purpose, and outcome. I outlined, point by point, the decision-making process behind every project choice that could theoretically be characterized as involving a conflict of interest and demonstrated in each case why the characterization didn't hold. I wasn't defensive. Defensiveness signals something to manage. I was thorough because thoroughness signals someone with nothing to hide. My analyst Kira, who had worked closely with me on the Caldwell project and the early partnerships framework, gave a statement voluntarily without being prompted. I found out later from Harriet that Kira had asked to contribute to the process because she was troubled by the allegation. Lars, who'd been across several of my project decisions in a peer capacity, did the same. 3 weeks after the investigation began, Harriet called me back into her office. "You're cleared," she said. "Completely. Every allegation was examined and not one holds. The investigation team's conclusion is unambiguous." "Thank you," I said. The complaint itself was found to be without factual foundation. She paused. "The process of tracing anonymous complaints through our system is limited, but there are metadata elements we can examine when the circumstances warrant it. HR has been doing that." I waited. "I can't share the specifics with you," she said, "because that's not within my authority at this stage. But I can tell you that the investigation into the complaint's origin is ongoing, and that you should expect to be contacted." I nodded. I thanked her again and left. I knew. I'd known for a while. But knowing and having it confirmed are different things, and I was prepared to wait for the confirmation with the same patience I'd brought to everything else. The call came 4 days later. Not from Harriet, from Vantis's HR director, a measured and precise woman named Gwendolyn Park. She told me that the investigation into the complaint's origin had identified, through a combination of submission metadata and cross-referencing with other information gathered during the investigation, a probable source. She said the finding had been passed to the company's legal team. "Is there anything you'd like to tell us about your relationship with the individual identified?" she asked. "We were in a relationship for 14 months, I said. "We ended things approximately 7 weeks ago." A brief pause. "That context will be relevant," she said. "I imagine it will," I said. "I'd like to speak with the legal team directly." I met with Vantis's in-house legal counsel, a composed man named Garrett Osei, in a conference room on the 14th floor. He walked me through what they'd found. The submission metadata that had been reconstructed, the language patterns in the complaint that matched other written communications from the identified source, the timeline correlation between the end of the relationship and the complaint's filing date. It was Priya, definitively. There wasn't real doubt. The company has grounds to pursue this independently as a matter of protecting its reporting systems, Garrett told me. But you also have standing to take personal legal action. Defamation, potentially malicious falsehood, depending on what we can establish about intent. It depends on what you want to pursue. I sat with that for a moment. I was aware that this was a decision point, and I was aware that there were arguments on both sides. The argument for letting it go. I'd been cleared, my career was intact, the relationship was over, and legal action would extend the situation for months and keep Priya in my life in an adversarial role when I prefer to have no reason to think about her at all. The argument for proceeding, none of that was actually the point. If she does this and nothing follows from it, she's learned that this is a viable option. She hasn't learned that there are boundaries. She's learned there are none. That's not a lesson I'm willing to underwrite. It wasn't about revenge. I want to be clear about that, because revenge is an emotion and this wasn't. This was a straightforward calculation about consequences and what their absence teaches people. I want to proceed, I told Garrett. Personal action? Yes. He nodded, made a note. I'd recommend engaging independent counsel. We can recommend firms. I'll make my own arrangements, I said. I left the building that afternoon and walked the long way back toward Gressley Lane through the Caldemere Park stretch where the plane trees were coming into early spring color. I wasn't angry. I wasn't performing calm either. I was simply calm, the way I always am when I've made a decision that I'm confident in. She thought that sending something through anonymously meant there were no consequences. She thought the channel protected her. She thought she could reach into my professional life from a distance and pull something down and walk away clean. She was wrong about all of it. My independent solicitor was a woman named Clara Toms, who came recommended by a contact in the financial services sector and who was, in the best possible way, entirely unmoved by the emotional texture of any situation. She was interested only in what could be established and what could be pursued. The defamation case is viable, she told me at our first meeting. The complaint contains specific false statements of fact, not mere opinion. The anonymous channel doesn't protect the complainant from liability, particularly now that the origin has been identified. The intent element is what we'll need to substantiate, but the timeline and the relationship context are compelling. What does she face? Potentially significant. Financial damages if we can demonstrate professional impact, and the delay to your expected advancement is documentable. We'd also be pursuing the matter through Van Tiss's own formal channels simultaneously, which means she may face consequences that extend to her own professional reputation. I nodded. I want to be clear about what I'm looking for, I said. I'm not trying to destroy her. I want her to understand, in concrete terms, what the action she took actually means. I want there to be a record. I want the experience of having to navigate a formal legal process to be the lesson. Clara looked at me steadily. That's a more restrained objective than most people in your position have. Most people are angry, I said. I'm not. But restraint doesn't mean doing nothing. The legal proceedings that followed were not swift. They weren't designed to be. What they were was consistent and well-documented and impossible to simply wait out. Priya received formal notice through her solicitor within 2 weeks of my initial meeting with Clara. I know, because Clara told me, that her first response was to request that the matter be resolved informally. I declined that through Clara with a single line. My client does not consent to informal resolution. I also received, through solicitor channels, a written statement from Priya that functioned as an apology, hedged in places, qualified in others, but containing within it the acknowledgement that she had filed the complaint knowing it was false. Knowing it was false. She'd written it in a way that buried the phrase, but it was there. I read it once, set it aside, and told Clara to maintain the timeline we'd established. The professional fallout for Priya was, as Clara had anticipated, significant. Foundry Creative became aware of the proceedings. These things move through professional networks, especially when they involve formal legal action, and she was placed on administrative review. I don't know the details of what happened within her firm. I didn't seek them out, but I know from a mutual contact, Delia, from Cam and Delia, who remained in both our lives with careful neutrality, that Priya had been deeply shaken by it. She didn't expect it to go this far. Delia told me one evening, in a tone that was neither accusatory toward me nor sympathetic to Priya, just observational. Most people who do things like this, I said, have convinced themselves that the anonymous distance makes it consequence-free. She said she thought, I'm just telling you what she said, she thought it would slow things down for you. She didn't think it would come back to her. That's the thing about actions, I said. They don't ask your permission before they have consequences. Delia looked at me for a long moment. Are you going to continue with it? Yes, I said. She nodded once, and we changed the subject. The case settled, ultimately, without a full trial. 7 months after I'd walked into Clara's office for the first time, Priya's legal team approached with a formal settlement offer that included financial damages, a binding acknowledgement of the false nature of the complaint, and an agreement to participate in a corrective statement process with Vantis's HR and legal teams. Clara reviewed the terms and told me they were fair, given my stated objectives. She's agreed to the acknowledgement, Clara said, in writing, binding, permanently on record. That was always the most important part, I said. I signed the agreement, not because I felt merciful, but because the agreement did what I needed it to do. There was now a formal, documented, irrevocable record of what she had done and what had followed from it. Anyone who encountered the situation in any professional capacity would be able to see, clearly, the chain of action and consequence. The story didn't end, it resolved. Those are different things. At Vantis, the advancement that had been briefly complicated by the investigation's uncertainty moved forward cleanly once I was cleared. The Nordic Partnership Initiative, which had been an early discussion when all of this began, was formally announced 6 months after the settlement. My name was attached to it in the capacity Harriet and the senior team had apparently been building toward for some time, as the project lead with a seat on the cross-regional leadership committee. I didn't feel vindicated by this exactly. Vindication is a reaction to having been doubted, and I hadn't doubted myself. But I noticed, quietly, that the architecture I'd built over years of deliberate, disciplined work had absorbed a direct attack and remained standing. That's what careful construction actually means. Not that nothing comes at you. That what comes at you doesn't get purchase. It's a Thursday evening as I'm writing this. Not that I'm writing it literally, but in the sense that this is when the reflection comes unbidden while the city outside my Gressley Lane flat does its usual evening thing and a glass of Castellan Red sits on my desk untouched. I think about what I've learned from this, which is really to say, I think about what this confirmed rather than taught. The first thing is that clarity costs nothing and protects everything. Every decision I made, to have the direct conversation with Priya about competitiveness, to request the investigation myself, to pursue legal action, to decline informal resolution, to sign the settlement on my terms. Every single one of those decisions came from the same place, a clear understanding of what was actually happening and what needed to follow from it. There was no panic. There was no anger. There was just a sequence of correct responses to a sequence of real situations. The second thing is more uncomfortable to name, but I'll name it. I think about what it must have been like to be Priya in the months after I ended things. Not sympathetically, exactly, but accurately. She had watched someone she'd been close to advance steadily and had felt that advancement as a personal diminishment, which is a painful thing to feel. And instead of processing that pain in a way that would have served her, she had channeled it into something that felt like power, an anonymous lever she could pull from safe distance, and discovered, over 7 months of legal proceedings and professional consequences, that it hadn't been either anonymous or safe. She needed there to be no consequences. She'd built her action on that assumption. And when the consequences came anyway, not in a diffuse or symbolic form, but in a precise and formally documented and professionally impactful form, she'd had to sit with the full weight of what she'd done. I don't regret pressing charges. I want to be honest about that. Not because I wanted her to suffer. I don't, but because the alternative was a world in which someone could reach into another person's professional life with fabricated accusations and walk away having learned nothing except that it didn't work this once. She needed to know that actions have weight, that the world has a memory, that distance, even digital distance, even the carefully maintained anonymity of a formal reporting channel, is not the same as consequence-free. I think she knows that now. The settlement acknowledgement is on record. The legal history exists. Her firm conducted its own review, and whatever followed from that is her story to carry, not mine to narrate. What I know is that she wrote to me once, not through solicitors, a personal message, months after the settlement, and said simply, "I'm sorry." Not the way I said it before. Actually sorry. I read it. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her silence with silence, but because there was genuinely nothing I needed to say. The process had said everything. The record had said everything. My continued advancement had said the thing that had perhaps stung her most in the first place. I closed the message and went back to the Nordic Partnership brief I was reviewing. Outside, the city was doing exactly what cities do, indifferent, continuous, entirely uninterested in private reckonings. And I sat at my desk with my untouched wine and my resolved accounts and the quiet satisfaction of a man who has never once confused stillness for inaction. Still water runs deeper than anything else. That was something my father told me when I was about 12, and I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. Not because I'm above emotion. I'm not. Somewhere in the last 14 months, I grieved the relationship I thought I had in that Thursday kitchen with the lamplight and the bell peppers and the city hum. I grieved the version of Priya who had earned my respect over 2 hours on a rooftop above Calden Street. But grief doesn't reroute. It doesn't revise what happened or alter what needed to follow. It just exists alongside the decisions, like weather alongside a building, present, acknowledged, not in charge. I picked up the glass of Castellan Red. I took one measured sip. I turned back to the brief. Outside, Gressley Lane was doing its Thursday thing, and everything at last was exactly what it was.
Thanks for listening.